Today's presenter is Lucidworks VP of Products, Gerald Kanapathy. Thank you for joining us today, Gerald.
Thanks, Aaliyah. As Leah mentioned, my name is Gerald Kanapathy. I am in charge of the products and product management at Lucidworks. Today I'm going to be talking with you a bit about security in Lucidworks Fusion and how that helps you to implement security for your data and your system for data that's stored in Solr. Now, I just want to give a little bit of background for people. I assume that everyone here is probably pretty familiar with Solr. Of course, it's the leading open source platform for enterprise search. It's used by 90% of the Fortune 500. I won't go too much into that. Now, who is Lucidworks? Lucidworks is a company that employs 40% of the active committers on the Solr project. We sponsor the Lucene and Solr revolution. So basically, we build and manage Solr. We really know Solr and contribute mostly to this code base. Now, Solr, again, everyone here is familiar. Solr is really open source done right? It's over the years we've seen that open source projects have been able to deliver world-class software, and arguably we can say that Solr is the best search engine and search platform in the world, regardless of whether we're talking about open source or commercial. Solr does it right with a full, true community-driven development and community governance. And of course, being open source, the benefits and the cost benefits can't be overlooked. It's been around for years. It's had, as we mentioned earlier, a massive install base. It's been, and due to that, it's been well tested. Well tested in terms of stability, power, basic product and network and security for, in terms of network and system and server access control. We'll talk about the other types of security, and as well as distribution, replication, and scaling. Now, as we said, Solr, is a great enterprise search platform, and it does open source right. But community-driven development, we've seen, doesn't necessarily do everything, and doesn't necessarily do everything well. In particular, there are some areas which stands to benefit a great deal from, a centralized or a strong, singular sort of vision. Among those areas are UI and user experience, integration into specific other types of systems, whether open source or more commonly other types of commercial systems. What we'll be talking about, which is security, and more specifically security around integrating security into an environment and security of data within the product, and domain-specific solutions, of which I'll touch on a little bit here today, as security does tend to be part of a domain-specific solution. But anyway, because of some of these things that community-driven development isn't good at, that's the reason that Lucidworks exists. That's the reason that Lucidworks built Fusion. We built it to address that. We recognize that Solr, as well as other open source data projects, are really good at building data platforms. They're good at APIs, but they're not good at some of those other things about, as I said, UI, UX, security, and integration. And that's really what Fusion is about. Today, I'm going to talk specifically about the security aspects of what Fusion provides to Solr. So specifically what we do, and just at a high level, we provide extended authentication, authorization, encryption, right down to the document level and collection level. Comes with security for protecting the Solr API. On top of that, Fusion provides security for individual documents out of the box. We'll talk a bit more about how that works. Support for integration into other enterprise solutions, including LDAP, Kerberos, tying in and using SSL for encryption in many places, and Active Directory. Now, I'll mention that the latest versions of Solr also include some Kerberos integration. We will work with that, and we'll talk a little bit about what we do with Fusion that goes a little bit beyond that to make it much cleaner and easier integration and into any sort of enterprises. And in addition to the ones that we already support, of course, we have a clean security framework that you can use to authenticate to other directory services as well as other authentication, single sign-on, OAuth, SAML, and other methods to go with it. So that's at the high level. Going down a little bit more, the key security integrations that Fusion provides. User-level authentication to the Solr API, and I will go into each of these a little bit more further on. Integration, and beyond just having user authentication, it's integration of those users and user accounts into existing enterprise directories, backed by LDAP or Active Directory, as well as Kerberos. We help you make it easy to provide item or document level access control in your search results. Of course, these, like anything, are things that can be built yourself in Solr, but we make it just work right out of the box. We mirror this. Part of doing that is mirroring the source document access control list and automatically trimming security results across according to those. In addition to providing security on the search results and the documents in search, we also provide a very fine-grained role-based access control in our Fusion administration and in the Fusion configuration, both in the API and the UI levels. So that means that we provide additional functions in Fusion for managing Solr, for managing your collections, for managing the data sources. All of those themselves can be secured with role-based access control in Fusion. I mentioned earlier there is an extensible framework for extending some of these capabilities to integrate better with other types of systems. We've already support integration for single sign-ons with Kerberos and back-end stores with back-end user directory stores with LDAP and Active Directory, but you could extend them to other sorts of providers that you might have. Finally, I'll touch a little bit on how Fusion's features and Fusion's pipelines help you to enforce data privacy. Importance in just simply storage of data as well as in sorts of governance use cases to help you to identify and remove personally identifying information, personal health information, secure protected information that you might, as a legal matter, not be allowed to store in your search indexes or return in your search indexes. So let's go in a little bit more and talk about each of those. So those of you who are familiar with Fusion know that even really up until we got Kerberos integration in the latest couple of versions, there was no user-level authentication to the Solr API. It was open so that anyone who had access to the API could really perform any action. It wasn't really a problem, but it did mean that if you were deploying Solr, any sorts of access controls would need to be something that you built yourself, usually by restricting network access and then providing your own proxy and functions. That winds up being a lot of work if you want a lot of detail. It's easy if you're just doing very simple things where you really only have one or two roles. But we recognize that for a real enterprise search solution, you typically want or need access control by user, by group, or role, and to have actually a differentiated role. Managing that's hard. What Fusion provides, one thing, is an API proxy that sits in front of Solr, manages and restricts and controls access to the API level of Solr, as well as the API level of Fusion and its UI. We provide granular access control on this down by the user level, and it works right out of the box. You just turn this on. You can create users. You can assign them roles. You can assign them individual permissions. It's a big help. Out of the box, of course, we provide a set of roles that make a lot of sense. There's an admin role which has unrestricted access. Naturally, you want something like that, as well as simpler ones that are only allowed search access. As you create different collections of data or have larger or more complex, you can create customized roles based on those. that will limit people to search particular collections, limit them to only being able to query versus being able to query and upload or delete or make changes to collections as well. So at the very simple level, just having the ability to control access to Solr at all is a big plus that we're providing via Fusion. Now, next thing that we provide on top of that is eliminating the need to manage your own user directory. We will integrate, so besides just letting you log in and create these, as well as having those roles, which is valuable, we let you tie into an existing enterprise user directory. Most companies are going to have, these days, Active Directory or other LDAP user directory store where at the very minimum you've got users and passwords provisioned. What that means is that you don't need to do this and manage this separately in order to control access to Solr. You leverage what's happening already in your enterprise directory. That means you can use existing users and user accounts. If you're managing and have the right groups stored in your LDAP server, you can use existing groups and assign those to roles so that you don't actually even need to worry about reassigning permissions if that's handled separately. If someone transfers to a different department, and that's reflected in the enterprise directory, that will be reflected automatically in Solr, so you don't need an extra step. You can use existing, a big plus is use existing password and account policies in these things, right? You don't need to worry about password resets, making sure that passwords are set. You don't need to disable users when they leave the company, things like that, because you're leveraging the enterprise directory. Now, of course, that sounds good and it's easy to say, but we also provide the ability for you to configure exactly how we integrate with your enterprise directory. That is, most of the time, or many times rather, you're not going to want to have every single user or every single group within your company have access. You may want to limit it to a specific group or sets of groups. You may want to limit it only to certain users. You may want to map those roles. Our configuration will let you actually do that. Over here we just have a sample of what some of this looks like. It's reasonably short, but it's very powerful. Connecting to your LDAP host, this is an actual, not working, but it's an actual sample that should work for an Active Directory, for example, for basic access. And you can see that you can actually specify fairly complex LDAP queries if you want. We provide templates out of the box for the most common uses, but if you have certain types of filtering, if you, as I mentioned, only want people with certain attributes or in certain locations or in certain groups to do that, and that information is encoded in your enterprise directory, you can tell Fusion to only allow those people access. All right, that's one level. That's the user, and that's simply the access to get to Solr that Fusion provides. Next thing that Fusion provides is it makes item-level access control really easy to do. One of the things that certainly when you run a query in Fusion, you can search for, typically it's going to return everything. The fact that we now allow you to have user-based access, the next step of allowing user-based access is to actually allow us to have different users see different types of search results, and to see different types of search results based on access control on those various documents. In other words, behaving just like the original store. So if, typically, one common use case, of course, with Solr might be to crawl and index and search things in a large file system or a file share or or a SharePoint directory or a SharePoint store or a content store. Users can authenticate to Active Directory in this case. Or Fusion rather, comes with crawlers that will crawl SharePoint, they'll crawl Windows file shares, and they will mirror the access control of those into access control lists within Solr. At the same time, or immediately after, the Fusion security proxy can enforce those access control lists. So depending on your user ID, who you're logged in as, it checks that, it enforces and makes sure that when you issue a query, it appends and says, and in addition to whatever the user queries for, it needs to be accessible only by that user according to his access control list, and demands that Solr only returns the trimmed search results. Now, this works not just according to user ID, I mentioned, as I said, but even according to group memberships. So, if a user is a member of a group and your access control list just says somebody's in a group, we will resolve those group memberships, figure out what groups each user belongs to, and issue and enforce the right query. Of course, this is something that some people have done in Solr in the past manually. It's hard work. It's hard work to do. It's hard work to do it well. It's hard work to do it, especially if you're worrying about integrating with these nested groups. Because we provide these integrations to your LDAP directories, and at the same time we're also providing the crawlers that pull the data and pull the access control list from the source systems, we're able to enforce and make those mappings occur just by adding a stage within the Fusion proxy, within the Fusion query pipeline that says to enforce this security trimming. So basically, what all that comes down to is all you need to do is configure your Active Directory, configure the crawl, tell it to mirror up those ACLs, and the searchers tell it to do security trimming, and it will just work. I mentioned also, Fusion provides a lot of other functionality besides just querying Solr. It provides the ability to manage Solr collections to some extent. It also provides a lot of its own abilities, such as, I mentioned some of them, being able to configure access to user directories, being able to configure data sources to bring data in, being able to also configure how user queries and enforce security trimming on those queries. All of those capabilities themselves are governed by role-based access control within Fusion, and you can see that. I've got a little screenshot here. We come with a few roles. You can create all of those. Each of those roles is defined by a collection of various different sorts of permissions and actions that they can do. These ones, the ones in the example you see, are kind of wild-carded. You can make them work with very specific, so you can create someone, for example, who is a collection administrator who can only perform actions, write reports, query, and upload data into just one specific collection, for example, rather than globally. And this capability works with LDAP groups. So, even though we come with these roles, we can simply say that these roles, the admin role or the collection admin role or any custom roles that you might create, will map down to a particular LDAP group, which means that you can define the capabilities and the roles, and you allow the enterprise directory to decide who actually has those. You don't need to manage those, have yet another system to manage who has access to the system. You let that get taken care of centrally in the enterprise directory. So those are the basics. Those are pretty rich, pretty useful capabilities that Fusion's providing for building any sort of enterprise search. I think they're pretty desirable and pretty important. Now, I've mentioned that we're doing we do out-of-the-box integrations for Kerberos single sign-on, integration with the backends with Active Directory or really any LDAP store. But of course, there are other sorts of systems that you might have that today we aren't currently supporting. But we do have an extensible framework, and it's possible that someday in the future we will build and support some of these ourselves. But in the meantime, it's pretty straightforward using our APIs and our plugins to create integrations. If you, instead of using Kerberos for sign-on, you want to use SAML or some other SAML-based authentication provider, or OAuth, or any other sort of single sign-on system, or web-based single sign-on. I'll just qualify that a little bit, like an Oracle single sign-on or CA's single sign-on or RSA single sign-on system. You can also extend So one level is just authentication. As I mentioned earlier, once you're authenticating users, what's really interesting and really useful is to then take that user identity and use it to limit the search results that are returned. And in order to do that, you can also mirror the access control list on the content stores that you're crawling. If you have any sort of custom content stores, if you have ones that we don't really support, although we do actually support a wide variety of ones in addition to things I mentioned like Active Directory, SharePoint, standard file shares, but other types of stores like Google Drive, Dropbox, Box.com that have content that has access control, it's possible to create, or if you have your own database and data store, if those are limited by certain access rules that you want mirrored, you can create your own, and you can make sure that as long as you also return back the right access control list, those will be respected and enforced on search, so that you can have item level security reflected in search results, even for custom data sources. And I'll mention something. It's one more thing that's a little bit different. Fusion's indexing architecture is based around pipelines. Solr has the concept of having plugins and various stages and filters that you can apply. Fusion does something similar, but it's a lot more modular, a lot more configurable, and we come with several different types of stages out of the box that you can just add via configuration, either through the API or simply through the user interface for specifying how to handle incoming data. One of the uses of this, of course, would be to specify rules for redaction of data, masking data, filtering data as you're indexing and documenting logs. I mentioned earlier that a lot of jurisdictions and industries will have rules around what sort of data you're allowed to keep in certain types of systems. You can, of course, secure your search system and your Solr system in the same way as the original source system, but it sometimes brings greater oversight and makes it harder to manage such a system and puts additional rules in place. Another thing that's often required is that you actually redact and mask out any sort of personally identifying information. So, for example, if you have log files or other types of files that may have someone's social security number or credit card information in there, we can filter those out. We can do these in a few ways. We can match patterns with regular expressions. That's usually the most common and straightforward way of doing that, is to just look for patterns that match either within particular fields or just in free text, and redact those out or mask those out. But we can also do more sophisticated things. We can use some of the natural language processing plugins to look for things that might be names, again, depending on the tightness of the rules for the governance rules that you have in place. We can do those. Now, you could do this, again, most of the things that we're doing are things that could be coded and could be built in Solr. The question and the thing that Fusion adds is that we make it easy for you to do this out of the box. It's modular. The component for handling it is in there. You can see the rules, and you can focus, instead of thinking about integrating and writing and deploying and storing the code, you can think about the business rule that you want. Like, how do I enter those patterns? What are the patterns that need to be there? You can give this to the business users who are responsible for managing what patterns need to be filtered out, or what types of entities need to be detected and filtered out. That's the last thing I want to mention. So that's an overview of how Fusion helps you provide better security around the data that you store in Solr. And at this point, I'm going to go on to the Q&A session. So, Aaliyah, if there are any questions on the line, would you mind bringing them back, and I'll do my best to answer them.
Sure, definitely. We do have a couple of questions. As I mentioned previously, if you think of any questions, feel free to enter them into the chat box on the bottom left side of your screen. So the first question we have for you, Gerald, is, do I have to re-index my data every time I change a user's information?
The answer to that is no, you do not. So now, the user's information, the users themselves are looked up dynamically whenever the user comes in. So who they are and what groups they belong to, that may change, but that will happen when they're logged in. The index data, we just index the access control list. So that access control list may be based on the groups. As long as the actual permission on the document doesn't change, as long as the groups don't change, you don't need to reindex the document. We will look at the user, we'll look at what groups they belong to, we'll take a look at then the access control list on the document, and if they match, it'll be fine. You don't, the only time you'll have to change it, of course, is if you actually change the permissions on the document, and in that case, you'll need to reindex those permissions.
Great, thank you.
Hope that answers the question. Do we have another one, I think?
Yep, we've got one more. So this one is, can your crawlers crawl secure systems?
Yes. In general, yes. Now, it's a pretty broad question. As we have something like 60 or 70 plus crawlers in different types of systems. It's a good number, but it's also not, as many as types of systems are out there. Generally, yes, we can crawl secure systems. You do need to provide the credentials to the systems to those crawlers. So for example, we can crawl SharePoint systems given that our crawler is configured to crawl as a user that can see these things. Same with Windows file shares. They don't need, a web crawls, we can provide credentials to those. So yes, they can. There are types of systems where may be more complex, or we simply haven't built those integrations. But for the most common types of things, typical file systems, websites, share crawls, and as well as relational databases, and a few other types of systems, Hadoop and HDFS, yes, we are able to crawl those systems, provided their crawler is provided with credentials that have access to see the data.
Great. There's actually one more question. Can Fusion encrypt documents in the index?
We do not provide native encryption of documents in the index, unfortunately, at this point. We do work with some providers that will provide encryption at rest on disk. There are several ways to do this. We can provide encryption of data as it comes into the pipeline. It does present some challenges in terms of retrieval and querying and indexing if you do such a thing. So we generally recommend lower level types of encryption if you're worried about it. So for example, on disk or file system level encryption. That's partly due to the nature of being able to search for certain terms.
Thank you. So that's all we have for questions. If you do have any questions that you didn't think of during this session, feel free to reach out to us via the contact form on our website. We will be sending a follow-up email to everyone who registered for this webinar with a link to the recording, so you can also respond to that with any questions that come up. Other than that, we thank you for joining us today, and we hope you enjoyed the webinar.
Thank you.